The neighborhood was unusually loud that morning, a buzz of rich voices and polished shoes echoing across the private road. Expensive cars with shiny black paint lined both sides like soldiers standing guard. The HOA board had called a special meeting, and everyone who mattered in the neighborhood was already inside the clubhouse. The glass doors gleamed in the sun, the smell of fresh flowers filled the air, and waiters in white shirts moved quietly between the tables. It wasn't just another HOA gathering. It was the day Karen had been waiting for. Karen, the HOA president, stood at the top of the clubhouse steps like a queen about to address her kingdom. She was wearing her favorite red blazer, the one she believed made her look powerful. Her diamond earrings sparkled every time she turned her head. Beside her, the other board members whispered nervously, straightening their ties and skirts. Everyone knew today was about the big deal, Karen's master plan, that was supposed to bring millions into the neighborhood and make them the most famous community in the state. She loved attention, and today she was glowing with pride. A soft engine sound broke through the chatter as a black sedan slowly pulled up in front of the clubhouse. It was clean but not flashy, elegant but quiet. Karen tilted her head slightly. She didn't recognize the car. The back door opened, and a woman stepped out. She wore a cream-colored business suit, heels that clicked on the pavement like clockwork, and sunglasses that hid her expression. She was clearly not just another resident. But it was the man who got out from the driver's seat that caught Karen's attention. He was tall and calm, dressed in a simple black suit. No gold watch, no shiny shoes, no loud attitude. He opened the door for the woman with quiet respect, waited until she walked forward, then slowly parked the car in the corner. His movements were smooth, precise, almost military in discipline. But to Karen, all of that didn't matter. She saw only one thing. A man who was clearly not one of them. "Looks like someone brought their driver," Karen muttered to one of the board members, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air. The woman beside her giggled, covering her mouth as if they were sharing a private joke. "He's not even wearing designer shoes," she whispered back. Karen smirked, crossing her arms. "Some people just don't belong at meetings like this," she said loudly enough that the man could hear. Two other board members snickered. Someone added, "Yeah, I wonder if he even knows how expensive this neighborhood is." The man didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. He just locked the car, fixed the cuffs of his sleeves, and walked slowly toward the back of the room where staff usually stood. But his eyes, deep and focused, took in every face, every whisper, every insult. He understood every single word. Inside the clubhouse, the room was dressed for a show. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, golden light falling over the polished wood floors. The big presentation board with maps and numbers was already set up in the front. Karen had ordered banners with the HOA logo, had flowers placed on every table, and made sure there were fresh croissants on silver trays. She wanted everything perfect because today foreign investors were supposed to visit. She wanted to look powerful, rich, and untouchable. The man in the black suit stood quietly at the back, hands folded behind his back, his expression calm and unreadable. He blended into the corner like a shadow. But he was listening. Every word of the board's conversation reached his ears clearly. He heard Karen laugh about how drivers should wait outside. He heard another board member say they should keep the help away from the investors so they wouldn't embarrass anyone. They thought he was invisible. Karen walked up to the front of the room, tapped on the microphone, and said in her practiced cheerful tone, "Good morning, everyone. Today our neighborhood steps into the future." The room clapped politely. "We have foreign investors coming in less than 30 minutes, she continued proudly. "And we are going to make history. This deal is going to bring millions of dollars. They'll build luxury villas on the lakefront. Our property values will rise. We'll have our names in newspapers. And most importantly," she smiled like she owned the world, "this HOA will finally get the respect it deserves." The crowd cheered, but in the corner, the man stayed silent. He knew something none of them did. One of the board members whispered, "Who's the woman who came with him?" Karen shrugged. "Probably some assistant or translator. But the real investors are foreign. They barely speak English. So everyone, smile and nod a lot, she said, laughing at her own joke. Another man added, good thing they'll have their own translator. We don't want to deal with accents. The driver's jaw tightened just slightly, but his face stayed calm. If they had looked closer, they might have noticed something intelligent, sharp, and patient in his eyes. But they didn't. They only saw what they wanted to see. A man in a black suit, a driver, someone to ignore. When the investors finally arrived, speaking rapidly in their own language, Karen faked a big smile and greeted them loudly as if they were deaf. She couldn't understand a single word they were saying. She just nodded and kept repeating the same rehearsed lines. She wanted to look smart, but it was obvious to anyone who understood what was happening that she was completely lost. The man at the back quietly listened. The investors didn't know that their casual side conversation was being fully understood. They talked about how arrogant the HOA president looked, how unprepared she seemed, and how the deal didn't feel right. They said they might walk away after the dinner. Their tone was serious. Their patience was thin. The man in the black suit understood every language they switched to. He stayed silent, watching. They didn't know who he was. Karen didn't know either, but she should have, because the deal she kept calling hers wasn't actually going to depend on her at all. As Karen laughed with the investors without understanding a single word, the man took a slow step forward. He wasn't planning to speak. Not yet. But this was the beginning of something they could not see coming. The power they thought they had would soon shift in a way none of them expected. The whispers continued behind him. Karen made another joke about drivers pretending to be important. The board laughed again, loud this time. The man simply looked at the door, his eyes calm, his breath steady. They saw a driver. But what they didn't know was that the man they were mocking wasn't just a driver. He spoke 9 languages. He was the key to saving their billion-dollar dream. And soon, when the world would stop laughing, they would have no choice but to listen. Karen had been talking about this deal for months, spinning it like a golden story that would change everything for the neighborhood. She loved standing at the center of attention. Her chin held high as if she was the reason their HOA existed. Every meeting she painted the same picture. Beautiful villas on the lakefront, golden streets, luxury spas, golf courses, and new swimming pools. She told the board they would become a community everyone would talk about, that people from around the country would want to move here, and most of all, she promised power, she promised respect, and she promised money. She repeated these words like a song, and they all believed her because they wanted to. They never asked questions, they just nodded and clapped like trained hands. But what they didn't know was that Karen didn't fully understand the deal herself. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The foreign investors were not ordinary businessmen. They came from a powerful international development group with projects worth billions across several countries. Their contracts were strict, their standards were high, and they didn't tolerate games, but to Karen, they were just rich people who wanted land. She thought smiling wide and pretending to be sophisticated would be enough. She thought wearing expensive perfume and showing off shiny shoes would make her look like she belonged at their level. She didn't bother to learn their language. She didn't bother to understand their culture. All she cared about was the photo that would be on the newspaper the next morning with her name in bold. She walked across the clubhouse lobby like it was her stage, her heels clicking loudly, her voice sharp as she gave orders to the board. She told them where to stand, how to smile, what to say and what not to say. She practiced her fake laugh in the mirror before the meeting, and she made sure everything around her screamed money. The floral arrangements were imported, the food was fancy but not too messy, and the banners were printed with her favorite quote, "Power belongs to those who build." She believed this day would be the day she became a local celebrity. The woman who had arrived in the black sedan earlier sat quietly in the corner. She was one of the representatives from the investment group, dressed in a cream suit, calm and professional. She didn't speak much, but she noticed everything. She noticed how Karen talked too much, laughed too loud, and tried too hard. She noticed how none of the board members seemed to understand anything beyond their own neighborhood, and most importantly, she noticed the man in the black suit standing silently. Near the door, the one they had mocked, he was watching everything, but unlike the others, his eyes were steady, like a man who understood far more than he revealed. Karen ignored him completely. She was too busy polishing her image in front of the board. "This is our chance," she said loudly. "Once this deal is signed, No one will ever question this board again. We will be the most powerful HOA in the state. Her voice was filled with pride. I want everyone to smile and act confident. Even if you don't understand a word they say, just nod and smile. She laughed. The others laughed with her, none of them realizing how foolish it sounded. The investors' vehicles started pulling up one after another. Expensive black cars with tinted windows, security teams stepping out first. Then the foreign executives in their dark suits and calm expressions. Their presence changed the air in the room. The laughter quieted. The waiters straightened their backs. Even the board members suddenly seemed nervous. But Karen didn't feel nervous. She felt unstoppable. She walked up to greet them like a politician on election night, smiling too wide, waving her hands like a queen. The investors entered the clubhouse, speaking rapidly in their own language. Their voices smooth but serious. Karen didn't understand a word, but she kept nodding, pretending she did. She threw in random English phrases and laughed at the wrong moments. The board followed her lead like lost children copying their teacher. It would have looked ridiculous to anyone who actually understood what was happening. But they didn't. At the back of the room, the man in the black suit listened quietly, his mind picking up every word the investors said. He heard their doubts, their frustration, their questions, and their lack of trust. They weren't impressed by the fancy banners or Karen's fake charm. They were already discussing whether to walk away. They didn't think Karen or her board had the experience to handle a deal of this size. They didn't like the way she talked over them. And they didn't like her loud fake laugh. Karen took them on a quick walk around the clubhouse, pointing at maps on easels, waving her hand dramatically like a host showing off a mansion. She said things she barely understood, throwing out numbers she had memorized but never checked. She smiled at every investor as if she was already the hero of the story. But the investors kept looking at each other with uneasy eyes, whispering in their language, and the man in the black suit understood every single word. As they walked past him, one investor made a quiet remark in another language. She has no idea what she's talking about. Another replied, they're not ready for a deal like this. And a third added, we should just end it before it gets messy. The man at the door didn't move, but his jaw tightened. He knew what these words meant for the HOA. If they pulled out now, the dream Karen had been bragging about would die right here, and she wouldn't even realize it until it was too late. Karen gathered them at the big table in the middle of the clubhouse, where papers, coffee cups, and pens were neatly arranged. She cleared her throat like a performer about to give the greatest speech of her life. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, dragging out the words. This is a historic moment. She had practiced this line in front of the mirror so many times. She believed it made her sound powerful. She smiled. She threw her hands out dramatically. She didn't notice how flat the investors' faces were. She didn't notice their tired eyes. She didn't hear their whispers in another language that translated to, she is wasting our time. The man in the black suit stood like a silent wall, his hands behind his back, his heartbeat steady but his mind sharp. He was watching everything fall apart in slow motion. They thought he was just a driver, a shadow in the background. But he was the only one in the room who truly understood what was going on. The investors were not here to be entertained. They were here for clarity, precision, and trust. And Karen was giving them none of it. The woman in the cream suit looked at him for a brief second, her eyes curious. She didn't know who he really was, but something in his calm face told her he was not ordinary. There was power in silence, a kind of control that didn't need to be loud, and while the board was lost in their fake smiles and rehearsed lines, the real story of the night was building slowly, quietly, behind the noise. Karen thought she was the star of the deal. But what she didn't realize was that everything she had built around her was as fragile as glass. One wrong move and it could all shatter. And the man they mocked just an hour ago would be the only one who could either save it or let it break. And he hadn't even spoken a single word yet. He simply stood there, listening, watching, waiting, knowing that the real storm had only just begun. The driver stood near the back wall like a shadow, quiet and steady. The room buzzed with fake laughter, clinking glasses, and the kind of pride that always comes before a fall. Karen and the board thought they were in control. They thought they were charming the investors with their polished shoes and shiny smiles. But the truth was far from it. Every time an investor spoke to another in their native language, they shared real thoughts. The kind of thoughts that made deals collapse quietly. They didn't think Karen understood a single word. And they were right. But what they didn't know was that the man at the back understood all of it. Every whisper, every side comment, every shift in tone. The investors leaned closer to each other, their words flowing smoothly in a language Karen didn't even recognize. Their voices were calm, but their expressions showed doubt. One man said softly, "She's bluffing. She doesn't know what she's talking about." Another added in another language, "They have no experience. This is a show." A woman investor sighed and said, "If this is the leadership, we can't risk our money." And the man in the black suit caught every word like threads weaving a dangerous picture. Karen, too busy performing, didn't see it. She thought every nod from the investors meant they liked what she said. She didn't know they were nodding to be polite. She smiled wide, her red lipstick sharp against her pale skin, waving her hands like a TV presenter. She pointed at charts she didn't understand. She kept saying the same rehearsed line about a bright future for the neighborhood, over and over, while the investors exchanged quiet looks. The kind of looks that said this deal was already on life support. The man's eyes scanned the room carefully, the way the investors sat with their arms crossed, the way one man drummed his fingers on the table slowly, the way their translator stayed silent, watching, waiting. This wasn't a happy dinner anymore. This was a gathering that could turn cold in seconds. He knew enough about business and people to feel the shift in the air. It wasn't visible to Karen, but to him it was loud, clear, dangerous. One of the board members leaned over and whispered, "They seem impressed." Karen chuckled confidently. "Of course they are. They're looking at greatness." Her voice dripped with arrogance. She didn't know that just 10 feet away, an investor was whispering in another language, "We should leave early tomorrow. She's wasting our time." Another replied, "I agree. This is not a serious partner." The driver's hands tightened slightly behind his back, not out of anger but out of focus. This was the kind of moment where one wrong word could break a billion-dollar opportunity. But no one else in the room understood how close they were to losing everything. Karen thought this night would be her golden moment, but in reality, the golden thread was already snapping, slowly. The woman investor leaned closer to the man next to her and switched languages mid-sentence. "She is pretending," she said. "She's confident, but she's empty." He nodded, his eyes cold. "Yes, we can't trust someone like her." Another investor at the end of the table added, "We leave tomorrow. I will call the board tonight." They thought they were safe behind their foreign words, but the driver heard every line. He could almost feel the weight of the deal crumbling under Karen's fake charm. Karen started another loud speech, bragging about her vision. Making up promises on the spot, the board laughed too loudly, their forced laughter echoing through the room like glass cracking. They didn't notice how quiet the investors had become, how distant their smiles were, how their body language had shifted from polite to closed. But the man at the back noticed every detail. He noticed the sigh, the eye roll, the way the lead investor tapped his pen like someone counting seconds. The driver had been in rooms like this before, not as a driver but as someone who understood power. He had seen arrogant people lose everything because they thought smiles were stronger than substance. He had seen deals fall apart in silence, and that silence was now creeping into this room like smoke through a crack, slow, invisible, deadly. Karen, unaware, turned to the board with a grin. "I think they love me," she whispered proudly. One of the board members nodded eagerly. "Of course, you're doing amazing." But at that very same moment, an investor said in a different language, "She has no respect for us. She didn't even learn a single word of our language." And another responded, "She thinks we're fools." The driver's heartbeat remained steady, his face calm, but inside his mind, he was calculating every word, every way this night could go wrong. He knew if someone didn't intervene soon, the investors would walk away and never look back, and the neighborhood would lose everything, the fake pride, the fancy flowers, the expensive banners. None of it would save them. The investors finished their whispered exchange. The lead investor pushed his chair back slightly. That tiny movement was like a spark on dry ground. The man in the black suit knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't just shifting position, it was a signal. It meant they were preparing to leave early. It meant the decision was almost made. Karen kept talking, louder and louder, as if noise could fill the hole in her presentation. The board kept smiling nervously. No one noticed the danger that was practically screaming through the silence between the investors, except the man who wasn't even supposed to matter, the one they mocked at the gate, the one they called the help. He knew he had to make a choice soon. He could stay silent and watch them destroy everything, or he could step forward and reveal what no one in that room expected. He didn't move yet, but his eyes had changed. His silence wasn't weak. It was sharp, heavy, it carried power. A storm was building behind those calm eyes. The investors stood up slowly, murmuring among themselves in another language. They were talking about calling their legal team, about pulling out, about how this was a mistake. Karen thought they were just stretching their legs. She actually smiled at them as if everything was fine. Her arrogance blinded her completely. The driver took one step forward, then another, his footsteps soft but solid on the wooden floor. His eyes locked on the lead investor. He didn't say a word, but in his head he already knew. This was the moment everything would turn. This was the line between failure and something none of them could imagine yet. The night wasn't over. The real story hadn't even begun. The air inside the clubhouse began to shift. The polished smiles on the investors' faces started to fade. Their conversations in foreign tongues grew quieter but sharper. Every word carried weight, and the man in the black suit heard it all. They weren't talking about the deal as if it was alive anymore. They were talking about it like something they had already decided to bury. Karen was still floating in her own pride, still laughing too loudly, still acting like she was the most powerful person in the room. She didn't know that power had already begun to slip out of her hands. She didn't see the cold looks being exchanged around the table. She didn't understand the soft warning tone in the investors' voices. But the man in the black suit did, and it made the room feel heavier. The lead investor leaned slightly toward the others and whispered in their language. "She doesn't even understand the basics of this contract. This is dangerous?" Another replied, "We should cut this before it gets worse." A woman at the end of the table said, "I will call my team tonight, we can walk away quietly." And then came the line that made the man at the back straighten his posture just slightly. "She is an embarrassment, let's not waste another day here." It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, it was quiet, calm, and final. It was the kind of voice people use when the decision has already been made. Karen leaned forward, flashing her bright red smile again. "I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, this deal is already halfway done," she said, waving her hands like a magician who didn't have any tricks left. She didn't notice the way one investor's eyes narrowed in frustration. She didn't see the tiredness written across their faces. She kept performing, kept lying, kept drowning deeper into a hole she didn't even realize she had dug for herself. The woman investor set her pen down on the table with a small, deliberate click. A small sound, but one that carried finality. Another man leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms tightly. The lead investor nodded slightly to one of his people at the door. A signal, subtle but clear. They were preparing to leave. Their interest was gone. Their patience was gone, and their respect for Karen had never existed to begin with. The man in the black suit didn't move yet. He stood silent, but his mind was sharp like a blade. He knew what those signals meant. This wasn't just a business dinner anymore. It was the slow death of a billion-dollar deal, and none of the board members had even noticed it happening. They were still sitting there, smiling stupidly, nodding at words they didn't understand, drowning in their own fake confidence. Karen laughed again, louder this time, as if noise could fix the cracks forming under her feet. "I think they like me," she whispered to one of the board members. The woman nodded like a loyal puppy, not realizing the investors had just decided to pull out. The investors spoke in another language again, their words cold and quick. "She is finished. This is not serious. We will fly out tomorrow. Let's end this." The man's heartbeat stayed calm, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just some minor deal. This was the kind of contract that could reshape the neighborhood, bring jobs, development, change lives. But all of that was about to be burned down by Karen's arrogance and ignorance. The lead investor stood slowly, adjusting his jacket. A quiet ripple moved through his team. They all began standing one by one, silent but firm. This was it, the silent warning before the door closed forever. They didn't need to say it out loud. Their body language said everything. The deal was done. They were walking away. Karen froze for half a second, confused, then forced another big smile on her face. "Oh, you're standing, are we doing the tour?" she asked with a fake laugh that hung awkwardly in the air. No one answered her in English. They answered each other in their language instead. The driver caught every single word. "We leave now. No more time wasted. There's nothing here worth staying for." A chill ran down his spine. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew he was standing on the edge of something that would change everything. He could stay silent and let it happen, let Karen's empire of ego crumble in front of her. Or he could step forward and break the silence. The weight of 9 languages and years of experience sat quietly inside him, ready to come out. Karen tried to hold on to control. Wait, wait. We haven't even signed the dinner contracts yet, she blurted out, waving her hands. But the investors didn't care. They had seen enough. She tried to call for the translator. But the translator looked at her blankly, unwilling to cover up her foolishness any longer. The man in the black suit watched the lead investor's hand move toward the door handle. That was it, that small gesture. That was the exact second everything the HOA had bragged about would fall apart. The dream, the deal, the pride, all of it would die the moment he stepped out, and no amount of money or fake smiles could bring it back. The board members finally realized something was wrong. Their fake smiles began to shake. They exchanged nervous glances. One whispered, "Are they leaving?" Another whispered, "Why?" Karen's face twisted into a forced grin. No, they're just stretching." But even she could hear the tension in her own voice. The investors turned, ready to walk. The room felt colder now, emptier, like all the golden light had been sucked out of it. The man in the black suit took a slow, deliberate breath, his eyes sharp, his steps measured, and for the first time that night, he pushed himself off the wall and walked forward, not fast, not loud, just steady. Like someone who knew the ground beneath everyone was about to shift. The investors noticed him. Their steps slowed. Their eyes narrowed with curiosity. They remembered him as just a driver, someone unimportant. But the way he moved now, calm and deliberate, didn't look like a servant's walk. It looked like the walk of someone who belonged in power. Someone who had been waiting for the right second to step into the light. Karen turned toward him, confused. "What are you doing?" She hissed under her breath, but he didn't answer her. He kept his eyes on the investors. He had stayed quiet long enough, listened long enough, watched this train wreck long enough. Now it was time. The warning was already here, but the storm was about to change direction. The entire room froze the moment he stepped forward. It wasn't a loud movement. No door slammed, no glass broke. Yet every investor, every board member, every waiter in the room turned their head toward him as if something invisible had shifted. His polished black shoes moved across the wooden floor slowly, each step calm and sure. The lead investor paused with his hand still on the door handle. The air between them felt different now, heavy, sharp, almost like a wire pulled tight. Karen stared at him in confusion, her painted smile faltering. Her voice dropped to a sharp whisper, "What are you doing?" "Stay in the back." But he didn't look at her. He never even turned his head. His eyes stayed locked on the investors, steady and unwavering. The investors whispered to each other in their own language. "Who is he?" One man asked, "Driver?" Another replied quickly, but their voices carried a thread of curiosity. Something in his walk, in the silence around him, didn't fit the image they had assumed. Karen forced a nervous laugh, trying to wave it off. "Sorry, he doesn't know any better," she said with a fake sweet voice. "He's just the driver." She didn't know that those words were about to fall back on her like a hammer. The man reached the center of the room, straightened his shoulders and spoke. His voice was calm, deep, and clear. But what made the entire room still was not just the way he spoke. It was the language he spoke in. He addressed the lead investor in perfect, fluent words of their native tongue. No hesitation. No accent that struggled, no clumsy phrasing. The sound rolled through the room like a wave, smooth, precise, and powerful. The investors froze mid-step. The lead investor slowly let go of the door handle, his eyes narrowing as if he was trying to understand what he was hearing. Then the man switched to the second language, just as perfect, answering a question one of the other investors had whispered earlier, one they thought no one in the room had understood. And then he switched again to a third language, clarifying something they had said over dinner, like a man weaving invisible threads together effortlessly. The investors' jaws tightened, their expressions shifting from disinterest to shock. The translator at the corner of the room lowered his headset slowly, almost like he realized his job just ended before it began. Karen's face went pale. The board members' mouths hung open. She tried to speak. "What are you doing?" She hissed again, but her voice sounded smaller now, like a balloon slowly losing air. The investors ignored her completely. Their attention locked on the man in the black suit. One of them asked a question in their language, testing him, and without missing a single beat, he answered in flawless rhythm, even adding details to correct the misunderstanding Karen had caused earlier. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was thick, like the kind of silence that happens when people realize the ground beneath their feet has shifted without warning. The investors exchanged glances, the kind of looks that meant something big had just changed. The lead investor slowly walked back from the door, his steps quiet, controlled, curious. Karen tried to step forward, waving her hands like she still had control. "You're making a fool of yourself?" she whispered furiously, but now no one was looking at her. The investors didn't even hear her voice. Their entire focus was on the man they thought was just a driver. The same man they ignored all night. The same man Karen had mocked loudly in front of everyone. Now speaking their language like he was one of them, not just speaking, but commanding their attention. The man didn't give a speech, he didn't raise his voice, he simply explained, clearly and firmly, everything that had gone wrong in the conversation earlier. He explained the structure of the deal the way it was meant to be presented. Not the mess Karen had created. He talked about the permits, the land, the legal boundaries, the cultural considerations, the financial timeline, the safeguards, the translation errors, and the misunderstandings that had built up silently over the night. Every sentence stripped away another layer of doubt from the investors' faces. Every word was a quiet strike at Karen's empire of lies. One investor stepped closer, asking him a direct question in yet another language, and without hesitation. He answered in that language too, flawless again. Karen blinked rapidly. The board shifted uncomfortably. The investors leaned in like students listening to a teacher they actually respected. The lead investor put his hand down on the table and said something to him in their language, short and sharp, a test. The man answered smoothly, without even blinking, and the lead investor smiled. For the first time that night, that smile wasn't for Karen, it wasn't for the board, it wasn't because of fancy food or golden banners. It was for the man in the black suit, the one they now saw clearly for the first time. Karen's chest tightened. She felt it like a cold stone in her stomach. The control she thought she had, the attention she believed belonged to her, the respect she thought she commanded, was gone. Ripped away silently by a man she had mocked without hesitation. She opened her mouth to interrupt, to pull the spotlight back, but the lead investor raised his hand gently to stop her, without even looking at her, as if she didn't exist anymore. The board looked helpless. No one moved. No one dared to interrupt him now. They could feel it. Even if they didn't understand the languages. They could feel the energy of the room shifting. The investors leaned in. The man stood tall, confident but calm. He wasn't begging them. He wasn't showing off. He was simply leading the conversation like it had belonged to him all along. The translator cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sir," he whispered to the investors. "He's accurate." One of the investors gave him a small nod, not taking their eyes off the man. Karen stepped back slightly, her pride cracking like glass. She had spent months bragging about this deal, preparing her show, and in 5 minutes, this man had taken all the power without even raising his voice. He didn't need to, because respect isn't begged for, it's felt, and in that room, every investor felt it. The lead investor finally spoke in English, his accent smooth and clear. "Why didn't you speak before?" he asked. The man looked at him calmly and replied, "Because no one asked." His words were simple, clean, and heavy. The investors nodded, slowly, like men who had just changed their minds. Karen stared at him, her mouth dry, her power slipping away like sand through her fingers. The man in the black suit stood where she thought she was supposed to stand. And he didn't have to fake a thing. The deal wasn't dead anymore. It was alive, breathing again, because the real voice had finally spoken. The table that once belonged to Karen's fake confidence now belonged to him. The quiet man in the black suit. The same man they mocked at the entrance. The same man Karen had called just the driver. Now stood in the center of the room with the full attention of a group of billion-dollar investors. Karen was still standing near the wall, her lipstick cracking at the corners from the forced smile she could no longer hold. Her fingers tightened around the folder she carried all night like a prop in a bad play. No one looked at her anymore. She had become background noise in the room she thought she owned. The lead investor leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes focused like a man who had just found the missing piece of a broken puzzle. The others followed his lead, some pulling their chairs closer, some nodding slightly. Their posture had changed completely. A few minutes ago they were preparing to leave. Now they were listening, engaged, curious. The man in the black suit spoke clearly, switching languages like it was breathing, explaining what needed to be done to fix every single misunderstanding Karen had caused without even realizing it. He didn't rush, he didn't raise his voice. He just laid out the facts, line by line, clean and sharp, the legal clauses, the zoning issues, the translation errors, the local permissions that Karen had bragged about but never actually secured. The investors listened closely. Their faces no longer cold, their eyes alive with interest. They interrupted him not to challenge him but to ask for clarification, and every time they did, he answered with the ease of a man who had already thought 10 steps ahead. Karen tried to cut in once, forcing her voice to sound confident. "Yes, that's what I meant earlier," she lied. The lead investor didn't even look at her. One of the others raised his hand to silence her gently. Their attention never left the man. She stood frozen in place, a silent witness to her own fading importance. The translator who had been hired to handle this meeting had taken off his headset now. Leaning against the wall with a small, stunned smile, even he knew what was happening. He had translated for powerful people before, but he had never seen a room turn like this. Not so fast, not so quietly. The investors trusted this man more than they ever trusted the board. The board members began shrinking in their seats one by one. They didn't understand the words being spoken, but they could feel the power shift like a storm passing over a roof. They could see how the investors leaned toward him with trust and how they didn't even look at Karen anymore. They whispered nervously among themselves, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet, but it didn't matter now. The deal wasn't theirs anymore. It was in his hands. The man walked to the large map board that Karen had set up earlier like it was a stage prop. He picked up a marker and drew clean, confident lines, circling key areas on the plan, pointing to legal zones, property boundaries, utility lines, and environmental risk areas, things Karen had glossed over because she didn't understand them. The investors followed his hand closely, nodding as if they had finally found someone who spoke their language. Not just their words, but their level of intelligence. The lead investor asked a question in his native language, something detailed and complex about land easements and future security. The man answered it like a professional who had lived inside this project for years, his tone steady, calm, no stammering, no guessing. He didn't just answer the question. He gave them a solution, a stronger plan than what Karen had promised. The lead investor slowly leaned back in his chair and exchanged a long look with the others. The kind of look that said, "We've found our man." Karen's heart pounded hard in her chest. Her smile was gone now, replaced by a tight jaw and wide eyes. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them to look at her again. But nothing came out of her mouth. She had built her power on thin air, and now it was being ripped away silently, piece by piece. The man continued speaking, laying out new steps that would protect both the investors and the community. He talked about cultural considerations they hadn't even mentioned before, showing them he understood not just the language but the business and respect they valued. One investor nodded slowly, saying in their language, "This is how real negotiations are done." Another replied, "He's not a driver, he's the deal." The lead investor looked at Karen briefly, a small, cold glance that told her everything. She was no longer needed. Then he turned back to the man and said something in his language, something respectful, and everyone else nodded. The translator leaned forward and translated it softly for the board. "They want him to lead the discussion from now on." Karen's body stiffened, her fingers went numb. He didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat, he didn't even smile. He simply nodded and continued guiding the conversation as if this had been his job all along. His voice filled the room like a quiet tide that no one could resist. The investors began asking about timelines, resources, future partnerships. They were no longer talking about walking away. They were talking about building something together. One of the board members whispered shakily, "What is happening?" Another replied, "He's taking over." But they said it with a strange mix of fear and relief, because deep down, they knew the deal was only alive because of him. Without him, the investors would have been gone an hour ago. Karen tried one last time, stepping forward with a forced laugh. "Yes, well, this was all part of the plan." But the lead investor raised his hand again without even looking at her. A quiet gesture that hit her harder than any insult. It was the gesture of someone dismissing her existence in the room she had built around her own ego. The man in the black suit calmly placed the marker down on the table, looked at the investors and said something final in their language, clear and solid, and when he finished, the lead investor smiled, a real smile this time, the kind that said the deal was no longer falling apart, the kind that said trust had been built. Karen's world cracked quietly as she stood in the corner of her own meeting like a ghost, watching the driver she mocked become the man who controlled everything. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment the entire neighborhood would remember. Not the day of her big victory, but the night she lost everything without a single shout, just the sound of a calm voice speaking 9 languages like a blade cutting through her crown. The morning after the meeting didn't feel like the same neighborhood anymore. The sun rose slowly over the lake, lighting up the clean streets and polished lawns. But something in the air was different. The clubhouse that had once been Karen's kingdom was now filled with quiet whispers. The same people who had spent months bowing their heads to her were now talking behind her back, their voices soft but sharp. Her name carried no power anymore. It carried only shock, embarrassment, and the sound of something broken. Inside the meeting hall, the investors had returned. Not for her, not for the board, but for him, the man in the black suit who had stood silently for hours before changing everything in one night. The big screen inside the clubhouse showed documents being reviewed, contracts being prepared, timelines being set. The investors were now sitting with their legal teams and translators, but they weren't looking to Karen for answers. Every question went to him. Every signature required his nod. Every important decision rested on his words. The board members stood off to the side like guests at their own party. None of them knew how to handle it. They had never seen power move this fast. Karen walked in wearing the same red blazer she had worn the night before, trying to hold on to the image of control she once had. But it didn't work anymore. Her heels clicked loudly on the floor, echoing like cracks in the silence. No one turned to greet her the way they used to. No one jumped to give her attention. The lead investor only lifted his head for a second, gave her a brief polite nod, and then turned back to the man in the black suit. She froze at the doorway, realizing for the first time that she was no longer the queen of anything. She was just another person in the room, and worse, she was in the background. The board members avoided her eyes, some out of fear, some out of guilt, and some out of sheer cowardice. Last night they laughed with her, mocked the man, thought they were untouchable. But today their loyalty had already shifted like sand underwater. The moment they saw who truly held the power, they turned. They didn't need to say it. It was written on their faces. They no longer followed her. They followed him. He sat at the center of the table, calm as always, his black suit neat, his expression controlled. The lead investor leaned toward him, asking questions in his language, and he answered with the same smooth voice that had changed everything the night before. No arrogance, no pride, just quiet precision, the kind of voice that people trusted, the kind that made deals solid instead of fragile, and the investors respected that. They respected him, they respected his mind, not the fake image Karen had built. A lawyer handed Karen a contract to sign. Her hands shook as she scanned it. It was the same deal she bragged about for months, but the structure was different now, the control clauses, the authority, the communication rights. Everything that once belonged to her and the board was gone, reassigned, reorganized, and at the top of it all, the name printed in clean, bold letters as cultural liaison and lead negotiator was his. The man they once mocked, the driver. She forced out a brittle laugh. This must be a mistake. But the lawyer didn't even look at her. No, ma'am, he said softly. The investors requested it. The board members stood still. No one defended her. Not a single person spoke. She looked around at the faces she once commanded like soldiers, but now they only stared back at her like strangers. No respect, no fear, nothing left. He looked up from the table slowly. Their eyes met for the first time that morning. But he didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he didn't need to. His silence was enough. It spoke louder than any speech could. Karen felt her throat tighten, the kind of tightness that comes when pride finally meets reality. The investors signed the deal that morning, a billion-dollar agreement that had nearly died the night before. But now it was stronger, cleaner, smarter, and all of it had happened because of him. The lead investor stood up after signing and extended his hand toward him. A gesture of respect, not toward Karen, not toward the board, but toward the man they once didn't even acknowledge. The cameras flashed. Journalists who had gathered outside captured the moment. The photo of their handshake would be on the news. The headlines wouldn't mention Karen, they would mention him. Karen stood in the corner like a shadow, clutching her useless folder, her chest heavy. The empire she had built out of cheap words had fallen without a single scream. No one needed to push her off her throne because the truth had done it silently. She wasn't the hero of the story anymore. She wasn't even a footnote. The board members rushed to shake his hand after the investors left, their smiles fake and desperate. They spoke fast, trying to attach themselves to his success, pretending they had supported him from the start. But he didn't care. He didn't need them. The lead investor announced in front of everyone that he would now oversee all communications between the company and the HOA. His word would be final. His approval would decide what moved forward. And Karen was left with nothing but a seat in the back row of the organization she once ruled. She finally walked outside, her heels stumbling against the pavement, the sound of celebration echoing behind her. Her world had shrunk to nothing, while his had expanded beyond anything they had imagined. Inside, the investors spoke to him with respect. The board listened to him with quiet fear, and the translator who no longer had a job smiled to himself because he had witnessed something rare. A man who didn't raise his voice, didn't demand power, but simply earned it. One word at a time, 9 languages, one calm mind. That afternoon, a journalist asked the lead investor why they changed their decision, why they stayed when they were about to walk away. The investor smiled slightly and said, "Because the right person spoke." Karen's name disappeared from the conversation that day, replaced by his. The man they once mocked as a driver now stood as the architect of their future. And as the neighborhood buzzed with the news, everyone who had laughed with Karen the night before realized just how quickly everything can change when real power speaks softly. He didn't need to humiliate anyone. He didn't need revenge. His success was enough, and in the silence he carried, the entire world finally listened.